Thanks, Bruce.
You're welcome.
And thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. When I talked to Jim a couple of weeks ago and asked if I could join the meeting, or Jim invited me, I'm not sure which way around it was, he told me you're a tough crowd, so I expect you to ask tough questions after this. But I wanted to let you know that I'm just very appreciative of all the work that you guys have done, because it's clear to me that you've been a big part of sustaining Amtrak over the years in terms of your lobbying and getting a lot of the congressional support and funding that we need to survive. And I think we're at an incredible point in time in terms of being able to move the dial forward in rail in this country. And I'm going to ask for your help in the whole reauthorization process, et cetera. I think there are changes that need to be made, but I think that we're going to be aligned and need to work together. So if I could ask for your help in the coming years, that would be great. I thought it would be good if I started for a minute and told you a little bit about my background. Not to make it about me, but I thought you might be interested. I come at this without a lot of rail experience, admittedly, mostly from the airline industry, but I do have a lot of just rail growing up. I was born originally in San Diego, California, but I spent a lot of my childhood in England. Took the train almost every day, so I'm well familiar with how train is a part of some people's lives and how it could be in our future. However, I was very interested in transportation all around, and I'm in the process of filling out my trains, planes, and automobiles ticket. And I started out in the auto industry. I graduated from college, and I thought, what am I going to do with my life? So I thought, I want to work in the auto industry. So I wrote a letter to Lee Iacocca, if you remember him, and I said, dear Mr. Iacocca, I have these plans that I think you guys should follow. And a few weeks later, well, a couple months later, I was working at Chrysler, and so had a few years there. And it was really interesting, but what I realized right away was that industry just moved so slowly. It took us 5 years to develop a car. The car was on the market for 7 years. So it took like 12 years for a full product cycle. And I just really wasn't wired that way. So I went back to grad school, and then when I left, I came into the airline industry, which turned out to be way more my speed. That's an industry that really moves every day. Every day is different. I was at Northwest Airlines in finance, sales, marketing, product development. And then one day a friend of mine came and said, do you want to move to Amsterdam? And I said, no, not at all. Like, that's kind of strange. And a couple weeks went by, had really bad weeks at work. I had a boss who was really difficult. And went back and I said, so tell me about this job in Amsterdam. And she said, well, we're setting up something called a joint venture. And we haven't done one before, but we're setting up a joint venture with KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, and we need someone to go over there and run the revenue management department. And I said, well, I don't know anything about revenue management. And she said, don't worry, it's just common sense. And I said, okay. So I moved over there, and I spent a couple years doing it. And it's an important feature of commercial operations throughout transportation of scarce resources. But it's very similar in railroads to airlines, and it really is a lot of common sense, as she said. Came back, ran the revenue group for Northwest Airlines in the Pacific. Spent a lot of time in Japan. Then I decided I was bored. I had been in the airline industry 13 years, went home to California, and ended up taking a job back in the Midwest with a friend of mine, and worked in the financial services business for a couple of years. Found myself at the company that was really the epicenter of the mortgage crisis. And so that wasn't a lot of fun, but we got through that. Worked for a small carrier called Sun Country Airlines in Minneapolis, if any of you know that. The guy who hired me was arrested by the FBI like 12 weeks after I started. And
it's a disturbing history.
Yeah, it is. It really is. So I checked online last night. He's still in prison. He did the third largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. $3.7 billion. And he used to lecture me about what a great entrepreneur he was, and, and how I should emulate him. And then later I found he had just been stealing money from people and, using it to run the airline. Did that for a few years, then a couple years. Went through Chapter 11. That was a real experience. Then my friends from Northwest called me and said, hey, we just merged with Delta. And things aren't really going well with KLM because KLM had been purchased by Air France, and things just weren't working well. So I moved to Delta for a few years, ended up running their international revenue group, and then Delta invested in Aeromexico, and small group, about 5% of the shares. And they said, hey, we started with this company down in Mexico. Things are kind of confusing to us. We need someone to go down there and kind of bring some order to it. So I agreed to move to Mexico City, spent 5 years there, helping to restructure Aeromexico in the commercial area, revenue management, pricing, loyalty, co-brand credit cards, all those kinds of things. And now I ended up at Amtrak. So I tell you that because I know I don't have a rail background, but I have a broad transportation background, and I'm really all ears to learn more about what's important, and that's one of the reasons I'm here today. So I count on you as being teachers for me in the future. So that's me. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of a background of why I came to Amtrak, why I think this is an important point in time, and why it's so exciting. So if you look at the last, say, 20 years, a lot of things have been going right. So I think Amtrak has a really hard time in the press and in the political world because people keep on saying, oh, why are we spending so much money on Amtrak? Why are we subsidizing them? But as Jim said, and as others have said, it's a really important part of infrastructure, and investments are necessary. And if you look at Amtrak and you think about the rail sector in this country, I think we've been earning a lot of credibility over time. We have the revenue and the ridership numbers going in the right direction, going up, and we have our debt and operating ratios going down, which is what we want to do. And if you look compared to 20 years ago, you'll see that our operating losses were about $1 billion a year. And last year, in fiscal year 2018, we were down to 168 million, and we hope to be about 20% lower than that this year. So and that's not about me at all. That's about, all the hard work that the people who have gone before me have done, and these guys have done. So I want to thank them, and it's a real shout out to them, because that is the kind of credibility that we need to continue the funding that we've had. So I think that this is just really great performance, and it's what's needed to keep the political dialogue going. If you look at more specifics, last year, our fiscal year 2018 ridership was 31.7 million passengers. And just to give you an idea, I know I don't want to take this back to the airline industry constantly, but that's about 10 million smaller than JetBlue Airlines. JetBlue has about 42 million. So I know we're not an airline, but that gives you a feel for the fact that we are a big transportation company in this country. I mentioned the operating loss is 168 million. It would be great if we could get that to zero. One thing coming from long distance is I have to acknowledge the fact that that number covers a lot of losses in the long distance group, because long distance is still running at over $500 million a year in our accounting. And our cost recovery overall is approaching 100%, which is what it would be when we get to zero on the operating loss side. So overall, I think these are great numbers, and we're going to see further improvement as we go forward. One of the things that sustains us in our business is capital investment. So record 1.46 billion in capital investment, 370 million in maintenance capacity. These are really important numbers when it comes to things like the Northeast Corridor. So we have a lot more maintenance equipment there, things like undercutting machines that aren't necessarily real sexy when it comes to riding the train, but it makes a big difference to the speed and comfort of the tracks. We have about $20 billion in infrastructure projects in the Northeast Corridor between the Hudson tunnels, the B&P tunnel on the west side of Baltimore that needs to be replaced, the Susquehanna River Bridge, the North Portal, altogether about 20 billion, more than 20 billion. So big funding needs there, some of which are covered, some of which still need funding. Modernization and development of stations. You're probably familiar with the Moynihan Train Hall in New York that's well underway. We have redevelopment projects at Washington Union Station, which will clean up the area between the Great Hall and the platforms. We have redevelopment projects in Baltimore, maintenance projects in Philadelphia going on. And if any of you have been to Chicago recently, the Great Hall and the Union Station is really a beautiful, it's really something to behold now. So great job to Amtrak management there on the renovations. Acela 21, so we are already under construction of the first train set for Acela 21. I should say Alstom is under construction of the first train set. We expect that to be finished in September and go to the Pueblo testing facility, and also to have the second train set, which will be used for testing on the Northeast Corridor at the beginning of 2020, so January 2020. And then a year after that, we should see revenue service. And then we have a pretty extensive fleet strategy over the next years to get us from where we are today to a new state of equipment in the future. So as many of you probably have noticed, if you've ridden the trains recently, we have completely renovated the Acela and Am Fleet 1 fleets. Now, it was limited in its scope because we were constrained by budget considerations, but all new seat coverings, cushions, carpets. We changed the lighting out for LED lighting to make to reduce energy consumption, but also provide brighter lighting inside the cars. So I think that those trains are really as good as they could be considering the age of the equipment. We have exactly the same type of work going on with the Am Fleet 2 fleet starting this spring. So that's a win for long distance. We have the Viewliner 2 fleet, which is continuing to be rolled out. So we have 70 baggage cars on the property being used throughout the system. We have, I think we have 24 diners now delivered, maybe 25, I think it's 24. Not all in use at the moment, but they will be. We have sleepers coming out throughout the next year or so, and we also have 10 combined sleeper and baggage cars coming as well. So our job in the next few months is to determine the rollout plan for that new fleet, and we should have an all Viewliner 2 flagship service sometime next year. That's our ambition. So that's yet one more thing that's a positive for long distance. Replacement of the Acela train sets, I mentioned that already. We also signed a deal at the end of last year for 75 new Siemens road diesels to start to replace the Genesis P42. So another good win for long distance. And then, as you probably know, we have an RFP underway at the moment for a replacement for the Am Fleet 1 coaches with dual mode train sets, which is what our intention is. So, you know, in that case, these train sets would be able to run over the Northeast Corridor from non-electrified points in Virginia, for instance, and straight along the electrified spine without a need to change motive power here in Washington. And here is, I think, one of the more inspiring pictures I've seen since I've been at Amtrak. This is an artist rendering of the new train hall in New York. So this is the Moynihan Train Hall, and many of you are probably familiar with the fact that this is immediately adjacent to the current Penn Station. It's one block west. It's the block west. It's behind the facade here that you can see in the background is actually the facade of the or part of the structure of the Farley Post Office building. And inside the post office building is this enormous glass ceiling which will rain down sunlight on the train area of the Amtrak station. So really excited. This should be ready basically in time for the Acela 21 launch. So the Northeast Corridor is really going to have a huge amount of inspiring product, I think, in a couple of years' time. And we also have a lot of good service coming up, being added throughout the rest of the network. It's not just about the Northeast Corridor, but we have a lot of potential new services that we've been working on with state partners. Our second Norfolk service started just a few weeks ago. We have some of the Connecticut shuttles being extended to Greenfield, Massachusetts in a few months. Some great college towns just north of there that are going to be serviced by the trains. We have a bit of a delay on the West Coast with the 13th Surfliner and the 5th and 6th Cascades. Those are due to some infrastructure and other issues beyond our control, but we want to get those into the schedule as soon as possible. We have other great discussions going on. State of Wisconsin wants to get more Hiawatha's as soon as possible. We just don't have the fleet at the moment. We've had great conversations too with the legislature and the governor in Minnesota about another baby builder, as we call it. So we have a lot of possibilities coming up in the next 5 years, I'd say. So I think this is very exciting. So I thought I should talk for a minute about the reason I was originally invited, which was long distance. How many of you read the service line, the 5-year service line plan that came out last week? Okay. Oh, wow, that's really impressive. I read it, but only just so. So it was actually prepared before I got to Amtrak, so that's why I had to read it. So we put an April Fool's joke in there for you. We wanted to see how well you read the service line plan. So I want to know, I'm going to ask, I have a couple of prizes here for the first person who can tell me what the April Fool's joke is that we purposely inserted in this service line plan. Does anyone know what the, no one?
Yes, Ed.
Oh yeah? What's that?
I think that you're not going to do any refreshing of the superliner cars, but you're going to study the yeah, and we on the west.
No, that's not the intention. But I'll give you a clue. Did no one get this? Yes. Almost.
Say it again, Mike.
Almost.
The error, or you're now revealing the intentionally placed misalignment of the caption is that this picture in your brochure, for those of you who can't see the screen, that shows the Empire Builder arriving at the Glacier Park station. And the caption says that this is an Empire Service train arriving at the newly renovated Schenectady, New York train station.
It is a good thing Governor Cuomo's not here to see that.
You know what? That's good enough. It's slightly off, but it's really exactly what I'm talking about. The caption on this photograph says, Amtrak train number 230 approaching or passing through Harlem on the way into Grand Central Station for the first return of an Amtrak train there in 25 years. I read that and I'm like, that's like not what I think of when I think of Harlem. So I don't think it was intentional. Anyway, I just wanted to lighten the mood a bit for the long distance service. Anyway, so I think that what's really interesting about long distance is it hasn't changed that much. It hasn't changed that much since Amtrak was founded 48 years ago, and in fact it hasn't changed, at least some of the services haven't changed for a long time before that. And that's great. I'm a real rail enthusiast. I'm a bit of a romantic. I love the train. I took the Southwest Chief a few weeks ago. I really enjoyed it. But I also know the world is changing, and so that's one of our challenges. If you look at the rail network today, I think what's kind of cool is it's actually bigger than it was 48 years ago. Now, there are some long-distance services that aren't there, but in general, there's more rail presence than immediately after Amtrak was first set up. So I think that's a surprising win, to be honest with you. But as Jim said, I think about reauthorization, we really all need to be on the same page here, and we need your support for reauthorization. So I'm going to be working with you guys. I'm going to definitely be listening to what you guys say. I'm going to listen to Jim in the next few months and work together as a team, because this is a tough crowd on the other side of the hill, and we need to make sure that they keep appropriations coming. One of the things that we do have that is a challenge for us, it's nothing that any of us can really can fix, but it's just a fact of life. One thing is demographics, and these numbers are somewhat dated, but in the 2010 census, if you look at the US population, about 52% of the population was over the age of 45. So those are the people who, in my mind, can really remember trains the way they used to be. They don't, so 48% of the population really doesn't have the benefit of remembering how trains were. They're kind of in this newer context of what they see today. And some of it's great. Like, as the country's becoming more urbanized, people are actually taking to rail transit more, and I think that's very encouraging. But if you look at long distance in particular, you'll see that we skew somewhat older by over 20 points, and this represents our demographics on our 2016 long distance routes. So you can see that we're already quite a lot older than the national average. And if you look at long distance trains specifically by train, you'll see that when we get all the way down to Auto Train, which perhaps is not a traditional long distance service, I admit, we're really older. And I include myself in that because I'm in this age group. But we really need to make sure that we're also kind of reinventing our long distance services to accommodate some of our younger customers. And that's one of the things we definitely intend to do. They expect things like Wi-Fi on the train. They're very connected. We need to get some of those solutions out there. So it won't happen right away. We have other priorities, but definitely I'm going to make sure that long distance is part of the priority, and doing things like renovating the superliners is definitely something we need to do. We need to renovate them. We need to add services like Wi-Fi. And if you look at what Via Rail has done in Canada, I'm not saying that prestige class is the benchmark, because that's clearly way off the scale in terms of affordability, but they've done some really nice things with some of their older equipment. So, I think there's a whole host of things we can do. Another thing that we can't really do much about is the population centers through which our long distance trains move. And this really is a challenge. This is a map of where our tickets on long distance trains are sold, basically. So you can see we're kind of coastal. We have a huge amount of sales in New York and the Northeast Corridor. We have quite a lot in California. We have some in Chicago. But if you trace the route of the Sunset Limited, the Southwest Chief, the Zephyr, the Empire Builder, we don't have the opportunity to pick up a lot of traffic along the way. And that's just life. We need to figure out other ways to sell tickets, because one of the things that we need to do here is we need to get more off-season traffic on our trains. If you look at our long-distance services, we're sold out in the summer. And we're quite expensive, and every year we try to increase our prices, and I think the team does a fine job of that. But in the winter, we don't have a lot of passengers, and that's one thing where we could move the needle in terms of increasing revenue and improving our operating performance. And here's the perfect example of why we need to transition Amtrak in certain ways. If you look at the dotted lines, that's where the long-distance trains run through the country. And if you look at the shaded areas, that's really where the population growth is at the moment and will be over time. And you see that we're really not that well represented in the Colorado, New Mexico area, in Texas, and in the Carolinas, Tennessee, Georgia, that area. So those are areas that are, I think, ripe for Amtrak growth in the future, and one of the things that we're looking at. But those are my thoughts on where we are with Amtrak today. But before we finish, I just want to bring you back to the chart that Chris showed us, because I think it's really the thing that you can help us most with. We really, really need your support in terms of pressuring Congress and all government entities on this host railroad performance issue, because this is what undermines the performance, the profitability, and really everything about the long-distance network. When we run our own services on our own tracks here at Amtrak, our northeast, so year-to-date, Northeast Corridor on spine, on-time performance, so plus or minus 15 minutes. The electrified portion between Washington and Boston runs 88% on time, and long distance is less than 50. So when we control the tracks, I think we run a good railroad, and when other people control the tracks, unfortunately we don't. We need to fix that. So that's what I'd like to add. That's why my one ask of you today. Thank you very much. Do we want to have questions now?
If you're
Yeah,
able to, okay.
absolutely.
Jay, did you have something you wanted to add or no? Okay. I wish you guys would get excited and want to ask some questions. I'm trying to see who got their hand up first. My goodness, I'll make it easy. I'll take Todd first.
So on-time performance, penalties, the data is what it is, and the hosts can say, "Don't bother me," basically, because obviously their first customer is their stockholders. What sort of penalties are we looking at, if any, to enforce this law?
Yeah, well, so when you say penalties, I have two meanings for that. So we have a contractual relationship, that we have an incentive and penalty system, and I think that's what you're talking. When I think about how effective they are, I think there's been a business decision by many of the Class 1s that they'd rather not earn the incentives because it's more valuable for them to run their freight ahead of ours, ahead of our passenger trains. And many of the contractual relationships have look back, so that they're only penalized to the extent that they earn incentives in the year prior to that. So it's not an incredibly effective system. But when we talk about STB enforcement, then they can craft potentially a penalty that would incentivize the freights to run us, to provide preference to us. And I think more importantly, I'd like to find out what the district courts would fashion as a remedy for a preference, because we've never seen that. Even the 1979, the one DOJ case didn't come to any conclusion. It was resolved without coming to a conclusion, and we saw some better performance after that. But I'm very curious what remedy they would fashion. I think they would be. My experience is the district courts are a little bit more aggressive because they're a little bit more politically insulated. So that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see that opportunity to essentially enforce our right.
And I'm going to go over here and then come back. And in the meantime, there was another microphone with a red cover. Do we know where that vanished to?
I'm going to bust you a little bit. Excuse me in advance. So when you talked about the long distance network and the equipment issues there, I hear a lot from our members, both rank and file and board and council members, when they see viewliner enhancements and viewliner refreshments, what they hear is east of the Mississippi. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk in a little more detail about what the plan is for Western trains, long distance trains, in terms of will there be potentially new superliners? Will we standardize on single level equipment? Do we not know yet? Kind of where are we with that?
Yeah, I
West
know.
of Chicago.
No, I think that's a fair question. So, I tell you what, I come from an industry of standardization and simplicity as much as possible. And one of the things that really shocks me about Amtrak, and I understand why, I mean, this is a lot of just how it's happened historically, but the complexity, every train is different. And I was talking to the product people the other day, and they were talking about food service cars, and they said, we have 10 different configurations of food service cars, and it's really hard. It's hard to board the food reliably and all this other stuff. So one of the things that I've really asked the team to look at right away is how can you create less complexity in the system in order to improve reliability, improve performance, improve employee work environment, et cetera. And so we're using the Viewliner 2s as a way to create more consistency on the East Coast. We can't do everything all at once, but use the East Coast as an exercise to say, okay, how can we make things simpler and more reliable within the world of what we have today? And so I think we'll get there pretty soon in terms of a vision. And the Viewliner fleet will help us do this. It'll provide a little bit more flexibility because we've been really short on equipment for quite a few years now. And this will actually potentially create a little bit more time and ability for us to think through what the West Coast, the bi-level equipment answers are. And I think that we really need to focus on the condition of the cars. We need to, we have a very successful cleaning audit program in place, primarily focused on the Northeast Corridor at the moment. I think we need to expand that. We need to look at equipment condition. Some of the bi-level equipment isn't in good condition. We need to go through a thorough renovation process there. But some of the cars, some of the Superliner 1s are really quite old. And we need to figure out what the long-term maintenance program is for them, not just from an appearance point of view, but also from a performance perspective. So in a nutshell, I think my point would be that we're biting off pieces that we can do one at a time. We're looking at the East Coast. I don't think we're going to take a long time to get to the Superliner fleet, but at this point, I don't have a plan yet, but we'll be working on it very soon. I'm going to let Jim or Bruce direct the questions.
Right ahead.
Good morning. I've got a friend who is a Amtrak conductor, and he, in the past, has really made an effort to upsell the sleeping cars. And lately, he has been discouraged from doing that, basically. He used to take passengers back out of coach, back into the sleeping cars, show them what it is, and would encourage people to go ahead and buy for the rest of the trip. And he would call in, and the way he explained it, and I don't really understand, there's an A, B, and C bucket, I guess. And he used to be able to get people to upgrade, but because now he is told the very highest rate, people are not interested. What he found was when he upgraded people, or in the past when he encouraged people to upgrade, they found how much they enjoyed the sleeping cars, so that the next time that they made a reservation, they specifically wanted to get on the sleeping cars. But he finds now that he's being discouraged to do that. Could you address that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think that it's a challenge that I've seen in my previous career as well. Look, I think that selling spoiled inventory or potentially spoiled inventory like a sleeping car that isn't being used is actually a great economic opportunity. I think the issue is not so much about the individual, but we need to have a comprehensive program to do that for the whole company. And because I totally support what he's doing, but doing it in the right way. I think when we have, and this is nothing about your friend, but I think when we have people doing it ad hoc, I think that that's part of the difference. I must say, though, that I totally get that this is, that we provide vital transportation to the interior of the U.S., and that in some cases it's a vital communication for populations. And if you look at of how diverse our product is and our customers are, and how we still play an important role in many people's lives.
Just if I can add one thing to that too, I think that where Amtrak has got a lot of focus on is providing daylight service on those corridors. It's just we're losing big opportunities. I think Fargo to Minneapolis, Cleveland to Pittsburgh. The time of day that we're serving there is just it doesn't provide the benefit to the folks that could really use that transportation because of the times that we're pulling into the station. So I think that's another thing we're focusing on, again, as we go into reauthorization. How can we provide additional service in those areas where we know we would get the ridership?
We're starting to run out of time. I'm going to ask folks to ask their questions quickly. We really only have time for probably 2 or 3 more questions. So let's...
Thank you very much for coming and speaking with us this morning. I think a lot of us would agree that, while on the one hand it's a great thing to be supporting the corridor, new mega region corridor service, as you mentioned, we also know about how it's the long distance services that are supported by Amtrak and the shorter, less than 400 mile services or so that are supported by the state. So how does Amtrak actually continue to support these services that it's suggesting improving or investing in if they fall within the range of state support?
So you mean the ones that currently are under 750 miles, or the ones that are over but should fall into a state support?
The ones that you're saying that where it's suggesting, okay, well, we have these mega regions, we want to develop services within them, but they're going to be so how does Amtrak actually fund those?
So I think there are 2 things going on. One is we need to engage with the state. So, for instance, we've had some very good progress recently with the state of Mississippi as well about the Gulf Coast service. So there are states that haven't been engaged until now who we are working with and we need to work with. And then I think the other thing is that in the reauthorization process, we need to figure out a funding mechanism. We need to preserve what we have, but we need to figure out a funding mechanism that actually helps us with trains that are over 750 miles, because there's some things that don't make sense to me. So the Palmetto falls in one bucket and the Carolinian falls in a different bucket, but they serve the same kinds of areas. We have problems with trains that could partially be state supported, but partially long distance, because the current legislation doesn't really facilitate a way for us to make that work. So I think I don't have the perfect answer for your question, but I think we need to tackle these issues as we go into reauthorization and get more flexibility in how to work with states and how to fund the overall Amtrak network.
All right, we're going to have time just for one more. John?
Hello, sir. I'm John Owen. I'm originally an employee of the old Auto Train Corporation, the original. We need to get service back on Chicago to the south, the old Floridian route. The Hoosier State, why not extend it to Nashville, to Louisville for a start? But take 2 more coaches. You'd pick up cities of millions of populations. It is ridiculous that in 40 years' time, that Amtrak has not on their own explored that very successful market of Chicago to Florida. The other thing too, why don't you guys go back to the tariff system to where you have a coach fare, roomette fare, a bedroom fare without the meals, simplify it, and then get the cost down. I was going to ride a quarter train $50 from Wilmington to Baltimore? Come on, Greyhound only charges 23. So we need to get the fare structure back to reality on some of the routes, and we need to improve services. But definitely Chicago, Birmingham, Louisville, Nashville, Montgomery, all of those cities, you guys need to look at again, because that's a huge open space, and 40 years is a long time. It'll be 40 years October 1st. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we have looked at Chicago, Florida, and a couple of permutations, not necessarily that exact alignment. The challenge we have is when we ask, Jay comes back, or the host railroads come back with numbers like $1 billion, literally.
Yeah.
And Jay, maybe you want to comment?
Yeah, so as we re-envision network, whether it's adding long distance service, whether adding state supported service, you're going to come across the two primary hurdles. So hurdle number one is if it's state supported service, who pays for the operations? How does it get funded there? And if it's and whether it's state supported or long distance on the access side, it's working with the host. Because you guys, everybody here saw the original bill for restoration of Gulf Coast service. So we're working again to try to get New Orleans to Mobile state-supported service, and we're trying to get that through a new modeling study that CSX is committed to, transparent effort. But it's I'm not. This is not news to any of you here that the bills for access are really high, and the only way we can get them to any kind of reasonable level is one, solve the problem of reauthorization, or two, fight it before the STB. So those are major hurdles.
So Jay, I just have to jump in on that.
Sure.
The bills are outrageous.
Right.
I mean, we know it doesn't really cost $2 billion to get from New Orleans to Jacksonville. We know it doesn't really cost $1 billion to do what you want to do on the Sunset. So I'm thinking STB, is that kind of the right venue to sort of challenge those numbers?
I think so. One of the now I guess getting into things that I shouldn't be talking about. One of my frustrations with one of those that we were talking about this issue with was, we got to run you, under PREA at 80% OTP. Well, you're not doing that now. So you're going to give me a bill for running me at 80% OTP. Are you going to commit to that? Are you going to give me a service outcome agreement for that? No. So yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it is, and I think you'd either have to solve it, like I said, in reauthorization and have some type of framework for that, and I think that's something we're going to work really hard on at Amtrak, or you have it before the board. And I don't know. As soon as you go to an administrative body that moves back and forth the needle depending on where who's in the White House, it can be a little frustrating. So I'd rather see it resolved by legislation as opposed to going to administrative body. And I got one last thing too. I just want to pick up on your one point about investments, because I think that's a really important point. I came from the Federal Transit Administration, so I think turning that dialogue around, because I just saw a recent article, I think by Art Carden, and it's very frustrating for me, because if we're not investing in public transportation as a country, then there are no metro stops. There's no VRE, there's no MARC, there's no SEPTA, there's no CTA, there's no Metrolink. Public transportation exists because of the investment that our governments, state and federal, make in the transportation system. That's how we get around. And that's not saying that they shouldn't be made unwisely and made with efficiency and reducing our losses as much as possible. But they don't exist without investment. So that's an argument I think is easily rebutted, because if it's about making money, then nobody's going anywhere on any type of transit or intercity service.
Can I just respond to one? Because I think it's important. I want to talk just for a minute about product and price. So I actually feel very strongly, as you do. I think that, the first thing is I think there needs to be more differentiation in product. I think that the bedroom product needs to be better than it is today. There needs to be content added back. I think it needs to be a product that we are proud to sell. I also think that one of the opportunities for us is to increase our sales outside the U.S. And certainly we'd need to make our product better in order to support that. It would help fund the system if we were able to sell those products at a higher price. And the other thing is I get concerned about the bundling of food and price because I think that it drives some kind of dysfunction in the pricing world where people don't have as much ability to price as they should, and I mean up and down. And so we have some technology underway at the moment called pre-order pre-select, which will allow people to order the meals they want in advance. And we need to figure out how to use that in a way to unbundle the price so that people have the choices and so that we don't have some of this lack of transparency in today's pricing world.
We have got to cut it off at this point. We are way over time. I need to be respectful of their time. I know Chris has a meeting he's probably late for at this point. I apologize for that. But I do want to thank each of you for coming and speaking with us today. I think we all learned a lot. And I think, Roger and Jay, you're going to be around for a little bit more?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So if you have questions, please don't surround like a pack of dogs. Be respectful. But really, thank you so much for being here. We do have some.